From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. I'm Ed Emmett. I'm a Baker Institute Fellow in Energy and Transportation Policy. And here at the Baker Institute, we tackle the most critical foreign and domestic policy issues of the day. Today's topic, child labor laws and immigration. Let's set the stage a little bit. With the immigration issues going on the U.S.-Mexico border, there's no question that the images of children have tugged at everybody's heartstrings, and they've become almost political pawns in that we say, are families being separated, are they not being separated, all these issues. But what is lost in all of this is, why are these children coming here, and how are we defining children? We're going to start with you, Luz. Many of these children come with a mindset that frankly is foreign. I hate to use that term, but foreign to us. They come here thinking not about school, but they come here thinking about going to work. The American dream taken down to childhood almost. So they see themselves, I guess, as providers, some of the caretakers of their own family. So if you could, in setting the stage, describe some of the school-related policies that need to be addressed for these children that are coming in. And then when they do get to school and they can't perform, frequently they give up and go to work. So how does all that tie together?
Thank you for that very important question. And before I outline three primary things that we can do in terms of school systems, I have to mention that we do have educational programs specifically designed to help migrant children, like the Migration Education Program, that work, but that can be improved. So the first thing is to facilitate their enrollment. And this includes, for instance, removing a lot of the bureaucratic processes so that it's easier for these children to become enrolled in school. The other one is to relax the exclusionary practices to make it easier for all of these children to be enrolled. And the other one is to protect the confidentiality and the privacy. Even though the children do not have to disclose their immigration legal status, sometimes and in some states, their caregivers or the sponsors are asked to do that. And that increases fear, which makes them less likely to enroll the children in the school systems. Number two is to create safe environments for a smooth transition so that the children can feel safe at school. And we can do this by implementing trauma-informed systems of care, and this can be done very easily within the classrooms. For instance, by changing the schedules, make it easier for these children, one-on-one education, smaller classrooms, which of course requires funding, and also ensuring the link to social services and resources to make sure that the basic needs of the children are covered, the needs for food, for shelter, for security and safety. And then to create support systems, networks within the school systems and in the community that can keep these children at school. And then the third point is to incentivize and fund multicultural education programs and teaching methods. So by this, I mean to extend beyond bilingual education and get to know who these children are, to take a strength-based approach that can focus on what are some of those things that these children are good at, what are some of the values, what's important to them, and tailor the educational programs and the teaching methods to ensure that these children can succeed. Facilitating access to e-learning devices, such as computers, and helping them work with them so that they don't fall behind. And then incentivize teachers that are from similar backgrounds of these kids to participate in these programs. And then going to the second point that you mentioned, how do we keep them on retaining them in school? And I think the strongest link will be to establish a reinforcement system that allows these children to see tangible benefits in their education, that allow them to see how learning English is going to help them eventually get better jobs, advance their social mobility, what's the investment so that they can get a return, and then involve the caregivers to change the mindset so that they can help the children stay in schools and help children fall in love with learning.
Tony.
The problem today is that in the last 15 years or so, we've seen more children participate in additional jobs. They are slightly more dangerous, I guess, in terms of their ability to perform them and the kinds of workplace that they participate in. And since 2015, which is essentially the last 8 years, we've seen hundreds of thousands of immigrant children that come to the United States with that understanding that Luz was talking about, which is we're going to work. We are going to the United States, we're going to work, we're going to send money home. If we can go to school, that's fine, but school is not the priority for them. And I think in the New York Times report that was published very early this year, all the research was done in 2022, we saw that literally hundreds of thousands of immigrant children were actually working packaging cereals in slaughterhouses, in construction, in roofing, and all kinds of jobs that are really designed for adults. The brain of a child is obviously not designed to measure the danger and to ensure that all the right precautions are taken. They're just simply pushed into the job, and we've seen that happening all over. And big corporations participate in this. Walmart participates in that. JBS, food processing plant, participates in that. Construction companies are participating on that. So clearly we have a problem, and these children are really unprotected because obviously they're largely without a parent or somebody that is taking care of them, a guardian. Many of them are placed with relatives, and those relatives already work in those jobs. So if you have a relative who works in construction, for example, and you have a 13, 14-year-old, and they're home, they said, oh, come along, we're going to put you to work, and things like that. So there may not be any malice behind it, and it may be in violation of U.S. laws, maybe done out of ignorance, but clearly these children are placed with relatives that are already engaged in work, and they just take them along and put them to work. And some of those children are also put to work because they have to pay for rent and for food. They're not living for free. They're living with somebody that accepted to take them in, and they obviously want some kind of compensation. And by the way, these children don't necessarily qualify for all the kinds of welfare programs that U.S. citizen children may. It's a very kind of complicated landscape when it comes to policy. But I think the fundamental thing here, going more to the core of your question, is this is a political failure, and this is also a bureaucratic or a government failure. The political failure is evidently the fact that Congress has refused to take a serious look at this problem. They didn't really think about that. 250,000 estimated children between the ages of 12 and 17 working under these dangerous conditions until the New York Times broke the story. That's when Congress began to have hearings and things like that. But they have refused to legislate on that, and they've refused to make them eligible to welfare programs and things like that. Congress is not acting on that. I think the bureaucratic failure has a lot to do with the fact that there's too many agencies involved. HHS, for example, Health and Human Services, they have to take in the children, unaccompanied children. They have to place them with a relative or in some stranger's home, or find a place for them to live and try to figure out how to accommodate them in the United States. But they don't have the capacity to really follow through. There are not enough social workers to actually follow every one of these children through school, through placement, through a development that seems reasonable. And of course, part of the political failure is that Congress has also failed to fund HHS and the ORR and all these agencies that are really overwhelmed with hundreds of thousands of children that are coming into the United States, and they have to deal with all of them. They have to place them, and they just don't have the actual bureaucratic capacity to follow through. What are they doing? Who are they with? Are they being put to work? Are they being sent to work? Are they being asked to work? And the companies don't often ask any questions. The problem is, one, HHS, which cannot follow through. It's just a matter of capacity on all these hundreds of thousands of children. And then on the other hand, you got the Labor Department, which is supposed to conduct all these inspections to ensure that companies are complying with U.S. law in terms of safety and obviously child labor laws, make sure that they're not in danger in the workplace and such. But we've also underfunded inspectors in the Labor Department. So they can only visit so many plants every so often and inspect so many places and sanction so many factories or so many construction companies and things like that. So again, I don't think there's any malice here. I mean, it's just that there are hundreds of thousands of kids coming in, an underfunded bureaucracy, the inability of an agency to follow through all the way with all the capacity that it needs, and of course the Labor Department underfunded to ensure that U.S. labor laws are complied with, one more aspect that I think it's important, and I think it's the tight labor market. It depends on where you look at the numbers, what databases you look at. We're talking about 10 million jobs and only about 5.7 million people unemployed. So companies are struggling to find the employees, the workers. And here's a 17-year-old, here's a 15-year-old willing to do the job, and they take them in. And so it's really a confluence of forces. There are political, bureaucratic, immigration, and also labor market forces that are leading us to this situation.
Okay, so Luz, you used the term sponsor. Who are sponsors? How are they found? Are they always relatives, or can they be anybody? And what's the role of the sponsor in making sure that this child is not treated badly?
Yes. So interesting. Just like Tony was mentioning, there are all different kinds of sponsors. And this is where we get into trouble in that there's not true assessments of who these people are at some points. So sponsors can be either a family member, it can be ideally a parent, but sometimes it's a very distant relative that the child doesn't even know in many cases. Sometimes it's employers, sometimes it's what they call a friend or a neighbor. And I think what happens is these people search for them in the sending countries. They start writing contracts so that these people are allowed to give that this is going to be my sponsor, but at some point is more of a contract of a business or a negotiation. And I can tell you there's a desperation in these children. I saw it when I had the opportunity to work at the migrant shelters for unaccompanied minors. And as I was coming in with staff, these children will come and ask us, can you sponsor me? Can you take me? They have been waiting in those shelters for a very long time, sometimes 3, sometimes 6 months, and all they want is out. So they're willing to do anything. So I think, how do we reframe or make sure to ensure the safety of these children in terms of sponsorships? And I think, like what Tony was mentioning, we need kind of like a check system so that we know who these people are, that there's periodic assessments and evaluation from social services so that we can keep track of the environment. But it's also important for these migrant children to know their rights and to have a path to safe reporting. Because a lot of the times they're afraid of saying or declaring some of those conditions of exploitation because they know that either there's no one else and they're afraid that they're going to be deported, or that it's going to take them too long and they have to go back to the shelter in order for them to be able to be in another setting. And then the other layer that I want to emphasize, for those families that do mean well, for those relatives that decide to take the children, maybe it is their sister children or parents who left their children when they were little, came to the United States and now they're being reunited after so many years. There's a need for funding for psychoeducational, psychosocial programs that can help reunify the families. It could be very traumatic. These are strangers. So it's important for us to begin to think about how do we help with the family dynamics in order to ensure the safety of the children so that they don't have to look for avenues like job in order for them to get independence, to get out of those situations.
So the sponsors, do they have to be some kind of family member, or can they be just?
Not necessarily. They can be, like I said, and it gets very tricky because sometimes they can be someone who offers employment to them or someone who says, yes, I'll take care of you, or it can be a friend of a relative. And you never know what that actually looks like because some of those connections happen in the sending countries under the water.
So I know this is going to get a little bit far afield, but is this something unique to children from Mexico, Latin America? Because we've had a lot of children come in over the years from, example, Vietnam, who seem to be totally focused on academics. They come here speaking no English, and they end up valedictorian of their class. Obviously, there's a different circumstance. So what do we do to sort of change this dynamic? What can we do to actually improve this?
Yeah, I think it's something that happens quite a bit with Central American children. I think we have to go back to their villages and their hometowns and the cities that these children come from. There isn't the expectation of long-term schooling. They often go to an elementary school. They're going to learn to write and read and addition and subtraction, basic stuff. and then they got to get to work. Even in those countries, you see a lot of children working. And so there's that expectation. And when the family is very, very poor, when they don't have sufficient resources and not enough opportunities, or if they're under threat, for example, of gang members in San Pedro Sula, Honduras, or in El Salvador, in San Salvador, in the capital, or any other town, the parents often choose to send them away because they're afraid they're going to be recruited by a gang, they're going to be the victims of violence, they're going to be recruited, especially in the case of girls sometimes, by the gang members as kind of their partners in the gang and things like that. And sometimes the children themselves feel obliged, especially in the 15, 16, 17 year old range, they feel obliged to move on so that they can go earn money to send money home. So there's different motivations, but they don't often come into the United States. These particular cohorts of immigrants don't often come with the expectation that they're going to study. They're coming for a reason, to work, because they're coming from conditions that are very difficult and they themselves want to help their families. Now, obviously, for the United States, this is a difficult thing to do because you cannot return a child. And I think even under the draconian measures that the Biden administration has implemented towards immigration at the border, one exception is children. They're not going to send them back. They're sending family units, they're sending adults back into Mexico, but they're taking in the children. And those are more difficult because, as I said, there's tens of thousands of them coming in every month. You're not going to send them to dangerous conditions in Mexico. And you got to figure out where to place them. And we just don't have the capacity. And as Luz mentioned, it could be almost anyone. And of course, these kids, especially those that come concerned with the economic situation of their family, they're 15, they're 16, they're 17, they're very aware of where their family is. They want to send some money back. And of course, the U.S. wants to put them in school. And many of them actually do go to school. But then they go to work at night. They go work in these shifts, and they're tired and they don't perform in school. They're kicked out of school. They have behavioral issues. Obviously, they're tired. They're working full-time or part-time. They're working late night. And so they just don't go through with school and they end up getting lost in the labor market. So it is a situation that I think is going to require quite a few resources, particularly the kinds of resources that every one of these kids that we're taking in and we're placing somewhere in the United States has to have a social worker. How many social workers do you need for hundreds of thousands of kids? And we're talking about serious resources. And I don't think Congress is willing to allocate the kind of money that is required to do that.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, absolutely. I certainly agree with Tony. And I think another thing from getting to know these children, from what I saw, from what I learned from them, is they are mini adults. We tend to, sometimes they come to the United States, they get into the educational systems, and they are treated with a condescending attitude. And that doesn't help. They see themselves as saviors. They see themselves as the heroes for their families. So they want to be in control. So this is when I'm talking about a strength-based approach of getting to know who these children are. Unfortunately, there's very limited research. And even when we try to work with systems, like for instance, we try to work with the Department of Homeland Security inside the shelters so that we could get to know who these children are, what needs are there, the doors get closed. It seems like there's so much fear about letting and collaborating and getting some of this information known, which tends to backfire because then they're put into educational systems that are letting these children down.
In companies, I have to add, companies are willing to take them in. They need the workers. If they're old enough and they think they can do the job, they'll take them in, and then they're willing to pay the $15,000 fine per child, or sometimes to threaten to dismiss the subcontractor that is hiring children. For example, General Mills or some cereal company that subcontracts the packaging and the boxing of the cereals and things like that. And so there's children working in those factories, and then General Mills simply says, well, that's subcontracted work. We're not really responsible. We're not the hiring. Or they have labor brokers, and these labor brokers in the construction industry, for example, they hire younger kids that really don't have the ability to be doing this kind of construction work. And so they hire them and they say, well, I'm not responsible. So there's always these individuals in the middle, right, intermediaries that hire the children, and companies can wash their hands off of that. There's been cases when companies simply say, hey, that I'm not responsible for that. The kids work here, but they're boxing the cereal that I sell in the store. But the boxing of cereal is not my operation, it's subcontracted. And then they say, well, we're just going to dismiss the company that boxes the cereal. And then at the end of the day, sometimes they get fined. Sometimes they say, hey, we can make the money. Walmart, for example, has been found in violation of this. And they can make the money pretty quickly, by the way. And all they've actually said is we're not going to do business with companies that hire children. But they don't send inspectors. They don't really mind. I mean, they get the product and then they put it on sale. So it's a very complicated thing in the labor market to actually get the companies to be responsible, ethically responsible, to make sure that the labor brokers and the subcontractors that they work with don't hire children. Obviously, the government is not going to authorize and allocate all the kinds of money that are required to ensure that kids don't work in these jobs. And I think we need to recruit and make sure that the companies that actually use that labor themselves take responsibility for not admitting child labor in their processes, even if it is subcontracted.
Okay, so we have just a couple minutes left. So in a sentence or two, what is the biggest change you would make to improve this situation? I'll start with you, Luz.
I definitely think that we need a multi-pronged approach. We need policies that can help us protect the children and get them into an educational system that allows them to advance the social ladder. We need psychosocial services to educate the children and the families in terms of the rights, in terms of the dynamics that are important to educate the educational systems as to who these children are. And we need social services that can improve the conditions of where these children live, learn, work, play, and are healed. So I would say that unless we work across all those systems, it's going to be very difficult to create a change.
On my part, I think we need penalties, and we need serious penalties against companies that hire children or do business with companies and subcontractors that hire children. Right now, it's an administrative fault, $15,000 per child found to be working, and $150,000 per child that dies in the workplace. To me, that's simply not enough. That's not enough of a punishment for anyone doing this. Paradoxically, there are states like Iowa and Arkansas and Ohio that are actually relaxing child labor laws to be able to get these children in the workplace. So politically, we're seeing a trend that's going in the opposite direction. States are interested in getting these kids into the labor market and getting them to work as early as possible. So we're going in the wrong direction. And I think that's where the president ought to use to the maximum ability his executive powers to ensure that there are serious penalties for these companies. And I think Congress needs to act and ensure that these laws are stricter, perhaps even add criminal penalties to that. And of course, I think we need to fund both HHS to follow through with these kids, and we need to fund the Labor Department to inspect more workplaces, especially those that are suspected to work with children.
This has been fascinating. Thank you very much. The public hears about immigration, they hear about children. They don't necessarily understand all the nuances, and the two of you have been really helpful, at least for our audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for addressing this very important topic.
Baker Briefing is brought to you by the team at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. Baker Briefing is produced by Victoria Jupp and Shannon Moriarty. AV production is led by Kevin Young. The Baker Institute for Public Policy provides meaningful policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the U.S., and the world. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research organization based in Houston, Texas. To learn more, including how you can attend a live podcast recording here on the campus of Rice University, visit us at bakerinstitute.org. And thank you very much for listening.